The morning Fen Aldous walked into the unemployment office and found her sister sitting at her old desk. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood in the doorway of the building she'd spent 4 years of her life in and thought, the coffee maker on the 3rd floor still has that crack in the lid. That was the thing about shock. It didn't arrive the way people said it would. It didn't feel like a wave. It felt like noticing something very small, very stupid, at exactly the wrong moment. Her sister smiled, not the guilty kind. The kind that said I was here first, actually. And then she turned back to the screen, to Fen's old spreadsheets, to the position Fen had been told was cut due to budget restructuring. Fen had believed that. She'd believed it for 6 weeks. She'd sent her sister care packages during the restructuring, because she thought Daria had been laid off first and was struggling. She'd lent her $200 for groceries. She'd listened to 45 minutes of Daria crying on the phone about how hard the job market was. She took the bus back downtown without saying anything. That was the decision she made. Not to scream, not to cause a scene in the building where she used to be good at something, not to become the kind of woman who fell apart in a government lobby at 11 in the morning. She was very good at deciding not to become things. The only place open that would let her sit without ordering food was a hotel bar called Marchand's, 3 blocks from the bus stop. It was the kind of place that had real marble counters and the kind of lighting that made everyone look like they had their life together. Fen did not have her life together. She sat at the far end of the bar, with her coat still buttoned, and ordered a rye and ginger, because it was the first thing that came to mind, and she was very tired of making decisions. She did not notice the man already sitting at that end of the bar. That was partly because he was so still. Most people, when they're at a bar, they're doing something. Checking their phone, watching the game, slowly becoming someone else by their 3rd drink. This man was just sitting. His hands were flat on the counter. He had a glass of something amber in front of him that looked exactly as untouched as he was. He was older, not old, but the kind of age that sits in a person differently than youth does. Mid-40s, maybe. Silver at the temples. A scar along his jaw that had healed clean. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Fen's rent, and it looked like he'd slept in it, except that no one who looked like him slept. Fen did not think any of this at the time. At the time, she was thinking about the $200 and how Daria had used the word struggling. The bartender came over. He looked at Fen, then looked at the man, and then looked at Fen again with an expression she didn't understand. "I'm sorry," the bartender said, and he was not talking to Fen. "Sir, I did say, this section is reserved." Fen blinked. The man turned his head. He looked at Fen the way you look at something you're about to catalogue, not something you're about to talk to. "She can stay," he said. His voice was flat, not unkind, just declarative, like he was used to saying things once and having them be true. The bartender nodded and left. Fen thought about leaving. She was a person who had made very reasonable decisions all day, and she could make one more. She could get up, find another bar, sit somewhere without the particular weight of whatever this man was carrying. She ordered her rye and ginger and stayed. This was, in retrospect, the decision that changed everything. His name was Harlan. She didn't learn that for a while. What she learned first was that he had an accountant problem. She learned this because they sat in silence for 20 minutes, and then he said out of nowhere, with no preamble, "Do you know anything about double-entry ledgers?" It wasn't a question. It was the way someone talks when they've been thinking about something for a long time, and they've run out of patience for thinking alone. Fen said, "I have a degree in financial administration, and I just found out my sister has been sitting at my old desk for 6 weeks while I thought I was unemployed." He looked at her again. Same catalos. So yes, he picked up his glass for the first time. "My accountant has been moving money in ways I didn't authorize. I've known for 3 weeks. I haven't been able to prove it in a way that would hold. What kind of moving? The kind that takes something from column A and makes it disappear before it reaches column B." Fen knew exactly what that looked like. She'd caught something similar at her old job 3 years ago, a vendor who'd been running ghost invoices through a real account. She'd flagged it in 17 minutes. Her supervisor at the time had looked at her spreadsheet and said, "How did you even see that?" And she'd never had a good answer because she didn't know how to explain that numbers had shapes for her, that ledgers told stories, that something wrong in the figures felt the way a wrong note felt to a musician. She said, "What software? It doesn't matter. It matters if the entries are time-stamped differently on different platforms. That's usually where you find the seam." He was quiet. He put his glass down. "I've had 2 forensic accountants look at this," he said, "and they didn't find it. They found parts of it, but not the shape of it." Fen pulled a napkin across the bar. "Do you have a pen?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced one. It was heavy, the kind of pen that was also a statement. She drew a quick diagram on the napkin. Not numbers, shapes. The way money moved through a system, which columns talked to which other columns, where the pressure points were in a standard double-entry system when someone was bleeding it slowly. "Here," she said, "and here. These are the places where it's hardest to see if you're only looking at what's missing. You have to look at what shouldn't be there." He looked at the napkin for a long time. "I have not," he said slowly, "had this explained to me this way before. Most forensic accountants are trained to find absence. I was trained to find presence, where Provincial Auditor's Office, before the budget restructuring." She picked up her drink, which wasn't actually a budget restructuring. Something shifted in his face, not softening, more like recalibration, like he'd put a number in a column and it had come out different than he expected. "What would it take," he said, "for you to look at the full set of books?" Fen thought about Daria at her old desk, about the $200, about 6 weeks of sending her sister grocery recommendations and listening to her cry about a job market that wasn't actually the problem. "Another drink," Fen said, "and then we'll negotiate." She did not know at that point who she was talking to. She found out the next morning when she woke up in her apartment with a headache that was fully earned and a business card on her kitchen table that she had no memory of accepting. The card had a name on it, just a name. Kellner, no title, no company, no address, a phone number. She Googled the name. She put the phone down. She made coffee. She picked the phone up again and looked at what she'd found. Kellner, as in Vincent Kellner, as in the man whose name appeared in court documents that had been sealed, then unsealed, then sealed again over the past decade, as in the man who 3 separate investigative journalists had tried to profile and 2 of them had quietly stopped writing about, as in a name that appeared in the background of photographs at events that were technically legitimate and technically not, as in, and she had to read this twice, the man who was estimated to control most of the private port logistics on the eastern seaboard and who the Montreal Gazette had once described, in a piece that ran for 48 hours before being retracted, as the quietest man in the country's loudest rooms. Fen stood in her kitchen with the coffee she hadn't drunk yet and thought about the pen, the way he'd produced it without hesitating, the way the bartender had looked at her like she'd sat down next to something dangerous and hadn't noticed. She probably should not call the number. She called the number. He answered on the second ring. "I looked you up," she said. "I assumed you would. I have questions. I assumed that too." "The first one," Fen said, "is whether your accountant problem is the kind of problem that, if I solve it, I become a person who knows too much." There was a pause. Not a long one. "That depends," Kellner said, "on what you intend to do with what you know. I intend to do accounting. I don't have political ambitions. I'm not writing a book. I have an apartment that needs a new hot water heater and a sister who owes me $200 and a career that has recently been restructured, against my knowledge." Another pause. "The work is sensitive," he said. "The pay reflects that. You would sign a non-disclosure agreement. You would not discuss the work with anyone outside of a very short list of people. How short? 3 names. What happened to your last accountant? He is currently explaining his choices to people who have more patience for that conversation than I do. Is he alive? Yes. He'll stay that way as long as he continues to be cooperative." Fen looked at the business card. She thought about her last day at her old job, how she'd packed her desk plant into a tote bag and taken the bus home in the rain, thinking at least I have severance. At least Daria said the market will pick up. She thought about the shape of a ledger she'd never seen, somewhere with a seam in it that 2 forensic accountants hadn't found. "Send me the files," she said. The first week was paperwork. Not the interesting kind. NDA. Background check. She didn't ask what it covered. A meeting with a man named Corvin, who was Kellner's legal counsel and had the energy of someone who had not slept since the mid-2000s, and who explained to her very carefully that the scope of her engagement was limited to accounts receivable analysis, and that she was not to ask about anything outside that scope, and that outside that scope was a phrase that could not be defined further at this time. Fen had worked in the provincial auditor's office. She understood outside that scope. She was given a laptop she'd never be allowed to take off the premises. The premises were a floor of an office building in Pointe St. Charles that looked like a mid-tier insurance company from the outside, and had on the inside the particular hum of a place where people moved fast and spoke quietly. She did not see Kellner for 4 days. When she did, it was because she'd found the seam. She hadn't meant to find it that quickly. It had taken the first forensic accountant 3 weeks. But she'd started from the wrong place. She'd looked at the ledgers as a system, not as a story. And the story in these particular numbers was that someone had been patient. Very patient. The kind of patience that looks legitimate for 22 months and then stops bothering to look legitimate because it's already gotten what it needed. She printed 1 page. Just 1. She wrote 2 numbers on it with a highlighter and left it on the desk of the assistant she'd been assigned. Kellner was in her workspace in 17 minutes. He stood in the doorway and looked at the page she'd left on the desk. 3 accounts, he said. 4. The third one is split. It's routed through a numbered company in Alberta, and it looks like a tax structure, but the transfer schedule doesn't match anything a real tax structure would do. How did you find the 4th one? It felt wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. That's not a method. It's always a method. The numbers don't lie, but they do perform. This one was performing. She leaned back in her chair. Your previous accountants were looking for absence. I told you that at the bar. There's nothing absent here. Everything is present. There's just too much of one thing in the wrong column, and it's been there so long that the weight of it has started to look like structure. He pulled out the chair across from her desk without asking and sat down. It was the first time she'd seen him sit somewhere that wasn't a bar, and he looked, if anything, slightly more dangerous. Like removing the marble counter and the drinks had taken away the last thing that made the context legible. The 4th account, he said. Where does it end? I need 2 more days to trace it. You have 1. Then I need more coffee, and I need you to tell the man outside this door to stop watching me work because it's distracting. Kellner looked at the door. Some signal must have passed. She didn't see it, because the shadow at the frosted glass moved away. 1 day, he said again. I know, Fen said. I heard you the first time. She found the end of the 4th account in 19 hours. The money had not gone far. That was the thing about patient theft. The people who did it well were usually also the people who got greedy right at the end, because they'd been careful for so long that they'd started believing the carelessness was earned. It had gone to a personal account, registered in the name of a numbered company, registered in the name of another numbered company, registered in the name of a woman who turned out to be the accountant's wife's cousin, which was the kind of detail that was so obvious it was almost affectionate. She built the full picture in a spreadsheet, not a pretty one. She didn't have time for pretty, but the kind that was airtight. The kind where every entry pointed to the next one and there was no exit that didn't loop back to the same name. She sent it to Corvin. She expected to hear from Corvin. She heard from Kellner instead. He did not say good work. He did not say thank you. He said, the engagement is complete. Corvin will process your payment. Fen looked at her screen. She had been in that office for 6 days, and she had slept approximately 11 hours total, and she had eaten, best she could calculate, 4 full meals, and she had found something that 2 trained forensic accountants had not found, and Corvin was going to process her payment. "I'd like to be considered for a permanent position," she said. The line was quiet. "That position," Kellner said slowly, "is not something we advertise. I'm aware. I'm not responding to an ad. I'm making a proposal. Fen Aldous. You have books that need watching. You have people who move money in ways you don't authorize, and you have a system for catching them that clearly has gaps in it. I found 4 accounts in 6 days. Your last person missed them for 22 months. She paused. "You're a man who thinks in terms of liabilities and assets. Put me in the right column." A long pause. "Come to the office on Monday," Kellner said. He hung up. Fen sat in her apartment with her cold coffee and her laptop and thought about what she'd just done. She thought about it for about 4 minutes. Then she opened a new spreadsheet and started building a pitch deck, because if she was walking into that office on Monday, she was walking in with something in her hands. Monday was not what she expected. She expected a meeting, a negotiation. Corvin with his "we cannot define that at this time" energy, and a stack of additional NDAs. What she got was a car, black, no plates she could read. The driver did not introduce himself, and she did not ask. They drove for 45 minutes outside the city. The building they stopped at looked like a retreat center or a very expensive mistake. Stone facade, birch trees. The kind of quiet that wasn't natural, the kind that was enforced. Inside, there were 3 men she didn't recognize and 1 she did. Kellner stood at a table with a set of documents in front of him that were, she could tell from across the room, not anything like an employment contract. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "The situation," he said, "has changed." The situation, as he explained it with the flat declarative certainty that was apparently just how he spoke to everyone, was this: the accountant had not been acting alone. The accountant had been working with a competing organization. The information he'd been moving was not only financial, it had been operational, routes, schedules, the kind of information that had a value well beyond money to the right people. Those right people had now sent someone to ask, politely, why the information had stopped. They sent a man to Corvin's house, Kellner said, to deliver a question in person. "Is Corvin all right? He's in Quebec City with his family. That doesn't answer the question." Kellner looked at her. "He'll recover." Fen put her hands flat on the table. She was doing that thing she always did when she needed to think, making herself still so the numbers could move. Except it wasn't numbers this time. "You need to know what he gave them," she said. "Yes. And how much they were able to use. Yes. That's not accounting. Some of it is. The rest of it is pattern recognition. You've demonstrated you're capable of that. I found a hole in your ledgers. That's not the same thing as..." She gestured at the room, at the documents, at whatever this was. "No," Kellner agreed. "It isn't." He pushed one of the documents across the table. "But I don't have time to find someone new. You're already cleared. You already know more than is comfortable, and you found the 4th account in 19 hours. Fen looked at the document. It was not an employment contract. It was more like a retainer, with terms that she was going to need Corvin to explain, except Corvin was in Quebec City recovering. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she said. "Stay. Work from this location for the next 2 to 3 weeks. Review everything the accountant had access to and tell me what he shared, when he shared it, and what its current value would be to someone who wanted to use it, and in return, the number at the bottom of that document." She looked at the number. She was very good at not reacting to numbers. She'd spent 4 years processing provincial budget sheets that could have fed municipalities for decades, and she'd learned to keep her face still. "That's for 2 weeks, she said. 3, possibly, and accommodation. The east wing of this building. I want an actual bed, not a cot. There are no cots, and I want to call my building super to hold my mail. That can be arranged, and..." Fen said, "I want to know one thing." Kellner waited. "The man they sent to Corvin. Was that meant as a message to you or to me?" He looked at her for a long time, longer than he usually did. The room was quiet the way the outside of the building was quiet, not naturally, but because someone had decided it would be. "Both," he said. Fen nodded once. She picked up the pen he'd set next to the document, the same heavy pen, she realized. The one from the bar. She signed. The East Wing had a real bed. She gave it credit for that. She did not sleep in it much. There was too much to read. 22 months of access logs. 22 months of correspondence. Not the kind he'd been authorized to send, but the kind she found in the metadata, in the timestamps, in the places where someone had been careful, except for the 3 or 4 moments when they hadn't been. She built a timeline on the wall of her room because she didn't have a whiteboard and she needed to see the shape of it. Post-it notes from a pad she'd found in the desk. Color-coded. Her one concession to visual chaos. Kellner saw it on day 4 when he came to check on her progress. He stood in the doorway of her room and looked at the wall for a long time without saying anything. "You could have asked for a whiteboard," he said. "I didn't know where to ask. You could have asked me. You're not very approachable." Another long pause. She'd noticed he did that, not because he was slow, but because he was very deliberate. Like every sentence was something he'd already reviewed for errors before he said it. "What does the wall say?" he said. She walked him through it. The timeline. The handoff points. There were 4, spread over the 22 months, always around the same week of the month. The likely contents of each handoff based on what the accountant had access to and what gaps appeared in the operational logs afterward. Kellner was very still while she talked. He asked 2 questions. Both of them were the right questions. She answered them, and then she said, "The last handoff was 8 days ago." "I know," which means they already have what they needed for the next window. Whatever they're planning to do with the routes and the schedule, they're planning it now. Also something I know. So what are you doing about it? He looked at her. "Currently, I'm standing in your room looking at a wall covered in post-it notes. And before that, and after this, I'm doing things that are outside your scope." She turned back to the wall. She had reached the part of a problem where she could see the shape of it clearly but not quite touch the edge. Like standing too close to something large to get the full perspective. She hated this part. "There's one handoff I can't place," she said. 8 months ago. The volume is wrong, too small to be operational information, too structured to be a test. Whatever he passed that time, it wasn't from the main ledgers. Kellner was quiet. "Kellner, it was personal," he said. She turned to look at him. His face was the same as it always was, flat, deliberate, like a ledger that had been closed before she could read the final entry. "Personal information about you," she said, "about the people around me, their patterns, where they go, who they meet." A pause. "It's a different kind of currency." Fen looked at the wall. She thought about Corvin in Quebec City, about the particular week 8 months ago when the handoff had been too small to make sense. She thought about how a man who controlled port logistics and moved through the world, like a closed parenthesis, might have a very small number of people around him who mattered, and about how exposing those people would be, in the right hands, more valuable than any route or schedule. "That's why they sent someone to Corvin," she said. "Not for a message, to confirm the information was still accurate." Kellner said nothing. "And now they know you moved him," Fen said. "So they'll update the profile, yes, which means the profile currently includes me." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "Because I'm in your East Wing looking at your wall and I signed a retainer with your pen, yes. You could have told me that before I signed. I told you it was both," he said. "You asked," I answered. She thought about this. She thought about the $200, about Daria at her old desk, about the unemployment office and the bus ride, and the bar, and the marble counter, and the rye and ginger she hadn't finished. She thought about the shape of 22 months of patience in a set of ledgers, about the 4th account that felt wrong, about the pen. She said, "Then I need to know more, not less. If I'm already in your books, I want to see all of them." Kellner looked at her for a long time. "That's a different conversation," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. It was the first time she'd really looked at him, and not at the problem they were both working around. He looked exactly as tired as she felt, she realized. Like someone who had been keeping accounts for a very long time and had stopped expecting the columns to balance. "Have it with me anyway." He did not move. He did not look away. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tonight," Fen said. "The window they're planning for is coming." "You said you know that." "So do I." She nodded at the wall. "I'm not going to sleep anyway." Another pause. The longest one yet. "I'll have someone bring coffee," he said, and he pulled the chair from the desk and sat down across from her, and outside the birch trees were dark and still, and for the first time in a very long time, Fen Aldous was looking at a set of books that nobody had told her she wasn't allowed to read.